I've been racking my brain for over a week to create an Easter message for this congregation. This is our Unitarian Universalist stumbling block, isn't it?
Yes.
Our UU challenge. Coming up with a message of significance that will rub shoulders with our religious culture and even our own UU deep and winding history of thought and beliefs as we reflect on the major religious event in Christian faith. And then preaching it to a group of zealous iconoclasts and free-thinking liberals. The Reverend Scott Alexander called it being theologically, quote, all dressed up and nowhere to go. The notion that we are tripped up by the supernatural lessons of Christianity, the doctrine of the resurrection of Jesus, especially when embraced as a literal fact and the absolute truth of life. And so we honor instead the vernal equinox, the coming of spring, nature and Earth Day, Easter eggs, or in this raging economy, maybe Easter marshmallows. Can you imagine? I saw that as an alternative. Can you imagine hiding those in the hot Florida sun? They would be gooey by the time they were found. I also saw potatoes carved in egg shapes as another option. It was not so long ago. It seemed we were on the cusp of a 20th century intellectual awakening in religious understanding. First, the Second Vatican Council of 1962 through 1965 promised an ecumenical alliance among world religions, a new appreciation for sacred values shared across the spectrum of faith communities. The recognition that every person has the right to religious freedom was one of the Vatican edicts. Second, Reginald Fuller's 1971 book called The Formation of the Resurrection Narratives opened with chapter 1 titled The Riddle of Easter. It began with this declaration, quote, a generation ago, the greatest New Testament scholar of the century, Rudolf Bultmann, spoke of the incredibility of a mythical event like the resuscitation of a corpse. Fuller explained that Bultmann himself did not see this as a major problem of the Easter faith. His goal was not to eliminate the resurrection from Christianity, but to interpret it correctly. Or as he said, demythologize it. The rest of Fuller's book is a commentary on all the resurrection accounts in the New Testament. And in the end, he concludes, quote, the Christian cannot be required to believe that the risen one literally walked on earth in an earthly form, end quote. By the time I entered seminary 5 years later in 1976, Bultmann was held in high esteem among us more progressive seminary students. He and others promised hope for a life as religious leaders that did not require us to surrender our intelligence at the door of the church. Third, an explosion of European and American theologians and philosophers at the turn of the 19th century, Jewish, Christian, agnostic. People like Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Soren Kierkegaard, Albert Camus, Viktor Frankl, Albert Schweitzer, Reinhold and Richard Niebuhr, Dorothy Day, Jean-Paul Sartre, Mahatma Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Joanna Macy. All of these were front and center when I began my divinity studies. Fresh ideas of what it means to live a spiritual life. Paul Tillich, for example, said that faith is the state of being ultimately concerned. Human beings, in contrast to other beings, have spiritual concerns, he said. We ask ultimate questions about the meaning of life, knowledge, mysteries of the universe. Tillich said we are driven toward faith by our awareness of the infinite to which we belong, but which we do not possess. We are born with restlessness of the heart. We are faced with a critical question to decide what is really ultimate in our lives. It's a natural religious impulse. We are born, we die, but we have intimations of eternity and the infinite nature of life. Our minds are expansive. Now, this is either a very cruel joke, an unsolvable mystery, or an invitation to spiritual awakening. Abraham Maslow said that we are endowed with a higher and transcendent nature. It's not a supernatural event, he insisted, but a natural evolution of our biological nature. We know Maslow for creating his hierarchy of needs in his approach to psychological health and wholeness. Our basic needs, he said, for shelter, food, and safety must be met before we can expect to achieve our highest potential in life. What did he call it? Self-actualization. Yes. But Maslow was also interested in religion. He wrote about it in length in his book, Religions, Values, and Peak Experiences. He said we can no longer rely on tradition or consensus, on cultural habit, on unanimity of belief to give us our values. These agreed upon traditions are all gone. Only truth itself can be our foundation. I want to demonstrate, said Maslow, that spiritual values have a natural origin. That they are not the exclusive possession of organized churches. That they do not need supernatural concepts to validate them. And so in psychology, he spoke about self-actualization. In religion, he spoke about peak experiences as the origin of spiritual values. Peak experiences, or you might say ecstatic moments, those awakening moments in our lives. A mother studies her newborn baby for an hours, just sitting and watching with love and awe. Friday night, I sat with a bonfire in a calm reverie in beautiful weather and just existed. From the point of view of the peak experiencer, each person has their own private religion. It can either be wrapped in a supernatural religious package or in a secular philosophy. Now we're getting somewhere, you use. This private religious experience is shared by all the great world religions, including the atheistic ones like Buddhism, Taoism, humanism, or Confucianism. They all have peak experiences. Maslow wrote, I see in the history of many organized religions a tendency to develop two extreme wings. The mystical and individual on the one hand, and the legalistic and organizational on the other. If you look closely at the internal history of most of the world religions, he said, you find that each one tends to divide into a left wing and a right wing. That is, into the peakers, the mystics, the transcenders, or the privately religious people on the one hand, and on the other, into those who concretize the religious symbols and metaphors, who worship little pieces of wood rather than what the objects stand for, those who take verbal formulas literally, forgetting the original meaning of these words, and most important, those who take the organization, the church, as more important than the prophet and their original revelations. Idolatry has been the curse of every large religion. In idolatry, the essential original meaning gets so lost in doctrine that the movement finally becomes hostile to the original mystical experiences, to mystics and to prophets in general. That is, to the very people that we might call the truly religious people. And so, the story of Christianity became not to live a life like Jesus, not to follow his example and teachings, but to worship and adore him as a God. Even though he said, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God." Not only did he say that, in fact, he said it in response to a ruler who asked him, "What must I do to obtain eternal life?" Jesus said, "You know the commandments." We might call them the spiritual values. "Oh, I do all that," the ruler said. "One thing you lack," said Jesus. He didn't say, "Bow down and worship me." He said, "Sell all that you own. Distribute it to the poor. You will have treasure in heaven. And then come and follow me." In 1962, the Supreme Court ruled on Engel versus Vitale. The court ruled that the state of New York cannot hold prayers in public schools, even if participation is not required and the prayer is not tied to a particular religion. After that landmark decision, Maslow said, a so-called patriotic women's group attacked the decision as anti-religious. I could sense in reading this that he began to get a little heated when he said they were in favor of spiritual values, they declared, and the Supreme Court was destroying them. Maslow said, "My reaction was automatic. I disagreed with the women's organization. But then something happened that set me to thinking for many months. It dawned on me that I, too, was in favor of spiritual values, and that I had reacted in an automatic way against their whole statement by the organization, thereby implicitly accepting their erroneous definitions and their concept of spiritual values. In a word, he says, I had allowed these intellectual primitives to capture a good word and to put their particular meaning to it, just as they had taken the fine word patriotic and contaminated and destroyed it. I had let them redefine these words, and now I want to take them back. Maslow expressed what I think many of us often find ourselves doing. What in fact our UU religion did in its historical movement away from our Christian roots. We let the conservative Orthodox movement label us as heretics, define what it means to be Christian or spiritual or patriotic. We let them invalidate us, silence the diversity, create a false dichotomy between science and faith, between belief and truth, between experience and ritual. We gave away our language. That's how I found myself as a UU minister in later years, invited to speak in congregations with the admonition, don't use the G word here. Unitarian minister Theodore Parker delivered a sermon in 1841 called The Transient and Permanent in Christianity. While his transient and permanent labels are somewhat dated when you read the sermon, in it he said the following: almost every sect that has ever been makes Christianity rest on the personal authority of Jesus and not on the truth of the doctrines he taught. Yet it is hard, he said, to see why the great truths of Christianity rest on the personal authority of Jesus any more than the axioms of geometry rest on the personal authority of Euclid or Archimedes. The authority of Jesus, as of all teachers, must rest on the truth of his word and not the truth rest on his authority. And I think that quite well defines the difference. Maslow said the great lesson from the true mystics, from the Zen monks, from the self-actualized and the peak experiencers, is that the sacred is in the ordinary. It is found in our daily lives, in one's neighbors, friends, and families. You know, our enemies have made a nearly fatal mistake. They have revealed their weakness. Turns out they are afraid of knowledge. They ban books and rewrite history. They fear truth. And we are a movement of truth seekers. Our path is clear. All we have to do is speak the truth and live the truth in love as much as possible. So, there it is. The place of Easter in our faith is this. It represents the core values of Unitarian Universalism. One, our refusal to accept anything at face value until we have a personal experience. 2, our commitment to growing in knowledge and wisdom through education, asking questions, and openness to change. And 3, our faith in the evolutionary nature of life, in our own God-given minds, if you will, in science and in education. In the original resurrection accounts, the meaning is not a history lesson or a medical miracle, but a proclamation. That was the intent of the resurrection stories. Not the resuscitation of a corpse, as Bultmann put it, but the message that God has offered a saving grace through the risen Christ. Life has meaning beyond the grave. The resurrection story gives us hope. In light of that hope, we can accept our role as we understand it, living fully, embracing life wholeheartedly. We can make the world a better place through love. So may it come to pass.